My dad burned the letter that said I earned the Medal of Honor. But he couldn't burn the live broadcast when the president said my name to the world. They didn't tell me the TV would be on. I thought it was just another morning in my father's ward, machines hissing, nurses whispering, that old window unit clattering against the July heat. I brought coffee like I always did, even though he never thanked me for it. The room smelled like antiseptic and loss. Dad didn't look up when I walked in, just stared out the window like he was watching something only he could see. He hadn't spoken much since the stroke, but even when he could, he didn't have much to say to me anymore. Then I saw it. The news anchor's voice, crisp and formal, cut through the hum of the machines. Today, the president awards the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Serena Kale. I froze. My name filled the room. It echoed against the linoleum floor, bounced off the 4 poles and oxygen tanks. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. But then they showed me. On screen. In uniform. That was me standing at the White House. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? I hadn't told anyone the ceremony was today. I couldn't. Because I'd never received the letter. Not really. 2 days earlier, I was looking for an old photo album at my parents' house. I opened the fireplace, flew out of habit. It always clogged, and there it was. Ashes. Paper. Edges not fully burned. I recognized the seal first. Department of Defense. My name, half visible, blackened around the edges. They burned the letter. They burned the letter. And now here we were. The world was watching me, applauding me, saluting me. And my father. He turned his head away from the screen. Slowly. Deliberately. As if the sound of my name offended him. That was when the nurse entered. Elise, I think her name was. She paused by the door, tray in hand, eyes flicking to the TV. She looked at me, then at him, then back at the screen. She stepped closer and, so softly it didn't feel real, whispered, "The president's waiting to meet you, ma'am." I blinked. For a moment, I didn't know who she was talking to. I looked behind me, as if someone more important had walked in. But it was just me. The room got quiet. She turned up the volume, just a little. Enough for the other veterans in the ward to hear the applause. One of them, missing a leg, oxygen strapped to his face, gave me a nod. Dad didn't move. No recognition. No pride. Just that same empty silence that had followed me home from every war I'd ever fought. I stood at the foot of his bed, hands shaking, heart pounding under the weight of 10 years of erasure. The TV showed the president walking toward the podium. My citation was being read aloud. And I realized this moment wasn't for him. It never had been. It was for every woman who got written out of the story. Even when she bled for it. Absolutely. Here's an emotionally immersive, first-person narrative expansion of. The last family dinner I attended was a week before the ceremony. It was supposed to be for my mother's birthday, just close family, nothing formal. I wore my uniform, not for attention, but because I had just come from an all-day training session at the VA. I hadn't had time to change. When I walked through the front door, the room fell quiet for a second too long. Mom offered a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't have to wear that," she said, brushing invisible lint from her apron. Dad didn't look up from his chair. And my brother, Matthew, gave that same smirk I'd known since we were kids, the one that always meant you're trying too hard. "No offense," he said later at the dinner table, between bites of steak, "but real combat's different from patching people up. I mean, I'm not saying you didn't serve, just, it's not the same." I didn't respond. I had heard versions of this my entire career from other soldiers, from reporters, from uncles, from online trolls who called me playing nurse in the sandbox. The worst part was how my family recycled their words like gospel. No one asked me what I saw, what I did. They just decided. Matthew tapped his glass with his knife and stood up. "Let's toast," he said. "To Mom, and to real heroes, men and women who go out there and do the ugly stuff so the rest of us can sleep." He looked right at me when he said it. The room chuckled politely. My mother gave him a soft "Matthew," as if even she knew it was too much, but no one stopped him. My dad just sipped his bourbon and kept his eyes on the wall. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I swallowed it. I'd learned long ago that defending myself here only made it worse. Inside my purse, the envelope was still sealed. Thick, official, with that weight only government paper carries. I had gotten it from my mailbox the day before and driven with it all the way across town, imagining maybe, just maybe, I'd read it to them. Let them see what I'd done. What it meant. That someone believed in me. I kept my hand on the flap under the table while they cut cake and passed napkins and complained about politics. No one asked about me. No one ever did. At the end of the night, as they cleared dishes and my mom packed leftovers for Matthew to take home, I looked at my father one last time. He still hadn't said a word to me. I wanted him to ask. Just once. But when I kissed my mom's cheek and said goodbye, I saw him rise from his recliner, walk into the living room, and turn on the news. Just like that. As if I was a guest. As if I'd never been born in his name or bled for the flag he used to salute. When I got home that night, I placed the envelope on my kitchen table and stared at it. I didn't open it. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I already knew what would happen if I did. They'd never let me be enough. And somehow, even before the fire, I think part of me knew they'd never let me keep it. It was supposed to be a routine convoy escort, nothing special. Just another sweltering morning on the eastern edge of Kandahar, where the heat crawls into your gear before the sun even rises. I was the only medic assigned that day. Our route was short, supposedly secure, and I remember thinking it would be a quiet one. That was before the explosion. One second, we were joking about who had the worst instant coffee in their kit, and the next, everything turned to flame and steel. The front MRAP disappeared in a blast that swallowed sound. I remember the windshield shattering like crystal and the air turning orange. My hearing went first ringing, then silence. I was on the ground before I realized I'd been thrown from the rear vehicle. My brain didn't even pause to panic. Training kicked in. I crawled toward the smoke, chest dragging in gravel and blood, not even sure whose blood it was. The two Marines in the first truck were barely conscious, both of them shredded from the waist down. One was screaming. The other had gone limp. My gloves melted when I tried to pull open the door. I had to use the butt of my rifle. I got the first one out with a belt wrapped around his leg like a tourniquet. He kept begging me not to let him die. The second one wasn't breathing when I reached him. I did field surgery with my bare hands and a snapped syringe. I remember whispering, stay with me, over and over like a prayer. Rounds were popping nearby. I couldn't tell if they were cooking off or incoming. No one else had reached us yet. And I knew in that moment, if I waited, they'd both die. So I dragged them. I dragged both of them out through fire and shrapnel, my uniform catching sparks as we cleared the blast zone. 100 meters felt like a mile. My knees were raw. My shoulder dislocated halfway through, but I didn't stop. I got them behind cover, started compressions on the second Marine, and radioed for emergency evac while applying pressure to the first. The medevac came 11 minutes later. They were both alive when they lifted off. I didn't cry until the helicopter disappeared. When we got back to base, they debriefed us like they always did. Cold. Fast. No follow-up. I was told I'd done what any medic would. Someone even said, "Good hustle, Kale. You'll make sergeant in no time." Later, I overheard two officers say, "Damn lucky she didn't freeze up. Would have looked bad if the only girl on the squad dropped the ball." I was never recommended for a medal. Not then. I asked once softly if the incident was being written up. My CO at the time, Major Renner, gave a laugh and said, "Come on, Sergeant. We're not putting that circus in a file. You got the job done, but no one wants to make a medic a hero, not unless they're in a body bag." He thought he was being funny. Like we shared the same twisted humor soldiers used to survive. But I didn't laugh. I just nodded and walked out. That was the first time I realized, if I wanted the truth to survive, I'd have to carry it myself. So I did. I saved the after-action report, the helmet cam footage, the names of the Marines I dragged through hell. I carried them like dog tags in my memory, because I knew someday someone would try to erase it. And I needed to be ready when they did. When I got home from deployment, I expected silence. That part wasn't a surprise. Most people don't know what to say when you come back from war, especially if you come back without visible scars. I didn't expect applause. I didn't even expect thanks. I just wanted recognition. The truth, at least. What I didn't expect was the lie. It started subtle, the way most erasures do. At a family barbecue, someone asked if I ever got close to any real action. I opened my mouth to answer, but Matthew cut in first. She worked in a clinic, right? Mostly treating headaches and heat stroke? He said it like it was a compliment. Like it made him proud that I was safe. I froze. My father nodded without looking up. Mom handed me a plate like nothing had happened. And I realized that's what they believed. Or maybe it's what they needed to believe. To them, I wasn't the woman who dragged 2 dying men from a burning vehicle. I was a field nurse who handed out aspirin. A supporting role in someone else's war story. At first, I tried to correct it gently. I told Matthew I was on a convoy when we got hit. That I performed emergency trauma surgery with no backup. That both men lived. He laughed. Jesus, Serena. You make it sound like a movie. Dad chimed in then, for the first time in hours. If something like that really happened, we'd have heard about it. You'd have been written up. Probably even decorated. That shut me up. Because I hadn't been. There was no write-up. No official recognition. Nothing in the papers, nothing in my record except routine medical intervention. And I knew why. Major Renner didn't file the recommendation. He never planned to. He made that clear when he said no one wanted a girl medic as the face of heroism. He didn't even try to hide it. So the story that followed me home wasn't mine. It was the version written by silence. By what wasn't filed. By what wasn't believed. At the VA, the other veterans treated me like a helpful assistant. Some called me Doc as a joke. One guy asked if I joined the Army because I couldn't get into nursing school. I didn't correct them anymore. What was the point? The official story said I patched up soldiers in controlled zones. Not under fire. Not during active combat. That's the thing about official stories. They're rarely written by the ones who bleed for them. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one night, flipping through the printed copy of my deployment record. Reading it line by line like I was studying a stranger's life. There was no mention of fire. No mention of blood. No names. No smoke. No screaming. No sprint through bullets with someone else's body hanging off my shoulder. Just clean words. Sanitized sentences. One line read, provided critical first aid to injured personnel during incident east of FB. That was it. That's how they framed it. That's what my family read. That's what they chose to believe. And in the absence of the truth, that lie became the gospel. Passed down from one dinner table to the next. I became a cautionary tale, the woman who exaggerated her service. The sister who couldn't just be grateful she made it home. The daughter who wanted attention. But the real betrayal wasn't what they said. It was what they chose not to know. After that dinner, the one where my brother toasted real heroes, I stopped trying to explain myself. It wasn't some dramatic decision. I didn't flip a table or storm out of the room. I just stopped. I withdrew the way soldiers do after too many close calls. Quietly, methodically, like packing up gear after the firefight ends. Not because it didn't hurt, but because you learn to conserve energy. You learn where not to bleed. I stopped visiting home as often. When my mom called, I kept it short. Work's been busy. Sorry I missed Sunday. When my dad was in the hospital again, I went, but I didn't stay long. I sat by his bed, read a book, answered when spoken to. Nothing more. I didn't bring up the convoy. I didn't mention the Marines I saved. I didn't try to explain the difference between being a medic and being a ghost. Because what would be the point? They didn't want my truth. They wanted their version of me tidy, feminine, forgettable. So I gave it to them. I smiled politely. I faded into the background. I let them believe I was just a woman who served quietly, nothing worth saluting. And behind that silence, I planned. I didn't need their permission to own what I'd done. I didn't need them to co-sign my courage. What I needed was space to breathe, to think, to build something they couldn't tear down. At night, after long shifts at the VA, I would sit at my desk and go through the records I managed to save. My old helmet chem drive. The bloodied field notes I kept sealed in a Ziploc bag in my duffel. The unofficial commendations from fellow soldiers scribbled on scraps of paper, stuff no one ever meant for press releases, but that carried the truth like gospel. I started documenting everything. Quietly. Log by log. Statement by statement. I traced the timeline of the ambush down to the minute. I mapped out where each vehicle was, who called for evac, who lived, who didn't. It wasn't just for proof. It was for me. Because the only way I knew I hadn't imagined it all, the only way I could breathe through the fog of being erased, was to build the truth piece by piece, like a soldier rebuilding a bombed-out wall. One brick. One name. One burned glove at a time. I stopped speaking in meetings unless necessary. I let others take credit for things I'd organized. I watched people underestimate me and learned exactly how useful that could be. Because when people think you're harmless, they forget to be careful. And that's when you learn the most. I began noticing small details, inconsistencies in the Army's paperwork, gaps in timelines, omissions in my own record that I hadn't seen before. I didn't act on them. Not yet. But I saved them. I stopped telling people I was fine and started just saying, I'm here. Because that was all I owed anyone now. I wasn't fighting to be believed anymore. I was preparing. There's a different kind of power in silence. Not the kind that comes from fear or shame, but the kind that grows in the dark, patient and sharp. They thought I had given up. They didn't know I was getting ready. People think silence means nothing's happening. But silence is where the real work gets done. While my father watched the news and ignored my existence, while my brother sent me Instagram links about girl bosses, while the VA passed me over for promotion after promotion, I gathered receipts. Quietly, thoroughly, patiently. I started with what I knew, the day of the ambush. June 12th, Kandahar Province. 2 wounded Marines, both transported by medevac and stabilized en route. I remembered every second, every scream, every burn mark on my gloves. So I went digging. My first stop was the after-action report. The one that had been sanitized down to routine medical support during localized engagement. The language was clinical, designed to flatten, to erase. There was no mention of the 2 Marines by name. No mention of how they got out. Just that they received immediate aid and were extracted successfully. The wording didn't sit right with me. So I cross-referenced the medevac logs. Dug through dusty VA archives. I found their names, Corporal Dustin Rangel and Lance Corporal Josh Nguyen. Both still alive. Both listed as 90% disabled from combat trauma. I remembered their faces. I sent in a request to see if either had ever spoken about the incident. I got a canned response back, but I kept pushing. I pulled the name of the field surgeon who had received them at Bagram, Captain Emmett, a no-nonsense type who'd once told me I had more guts than half the Rangers on base. He'd filled out a casualty intake sheet. And on the bottom, under Initial Intervention, he had handwritten, tourniquets in place, bleeding controlled, airway secured, all prior to arrival. Likely field medic unknown. That was me. It wasn't official proof, but it was a thread. And I kept pulling. I downloaded the footage from my helmet cam. It had corrupted over the years, but I managed to restore segments. You could see the smoke, the burning vehicle, a body slung over my back. My breathing was ragged, frantic. My voice yelling coordinates into the comms. My hands covered in someone else's blood. I watched it all alone in my apartment, the light from my laptop the only thing keeping the darkness back. Then came the biggest find of all, buried in an outdated personnel archive, almost forgotten. A recommendation memo, dated weeks after the incident. Typed in official language, signed only at the bottom by a name I hadn't seen in years, Lieutenant Colonel Anaya Cortez. My CO after Major Runner rotated out. She had written that I performed extraordinary valor under fire. That I likely saved multiple lives through direct, immediate intervention under active threat. That she was submitting me for formal recognition. But the memo had never been processed. No stamp. No routing number. No forwarding to command. It had been shelved. Or buried. I printed it. Highlighted the phrases. filed it in a binder I kept under my bed. I copied every video file to 3 different hard drives. I scanned the casualty logs, catalog dates, log timelines. If they ever asked, if anyone ever questioned what I'd done, I wouldn't have to argue. I'd show them. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about recognition, not really. It was about the record. Because history forgets women like me on purpose. And I wasn't going to let them write me out of my own life. I hadn't spoken to Lieutenant Colonel Anaya Cortez in nearly 3 years. Last I heard, she had transferred to Fort Belvoir and was working in some strategic advisory role. The kind of posts they give women like her when they're too competent to ignore but too direct to promote. She had always walked a razor-thin line between respect and resentment, not just because she was a Latina woman in command, but because she didn't smile when men expected her to. I'd thought about reaching out dozens of times. Each time, I stopped myself. I didn't want to seem desperate. Or worse, needy. So when her name appeared on my phone one random Wednesday night, I stared at it for a full minute before answering. "Kale," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Firm. Flat. Like a woman who didn't waste words. "You got a minute?" I cleared my throat. "Yes, ma'am." There was a pause. A static breath. Then, "You remember that day in Kandahar?" I blinked. "I remember every second." "So do I," she said. "I filed a recommendation. I assume you found it." I nodded before realizing she couldn't see me. "Yes, I did." "I thought you would," she said. "Did you also notice it never made it past internal routing?" I swallowed. "Yes." She sighed, not in defeat, but in confirmation. Like she had been carrying the same weight and was finally setting it down. "I've been sitting on this a long time, Kale. I didn't forget you. But you know how this place works." Command changed. Politics shifted. Major Renner never backed my paperwork. His version of the report went up the chain first. I felt my stomach tighten. "But I submitted again," she said. 6 months ago. Directly to DOD. I sat up straighter. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it would move forward. It's taken years to get the right eyes on it. But now it's gaining momentum." She paused, then added, "They saw your footage." I closed my eyes. The helmet cam. The Marines. The blood. All of it, now seen, now undeniable. "They're moving to award you the Medal of Honor," she said. "It's not finalized yet, but you'll hear from them soon." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. She continued, "It won't erase what they didn't do. But it puts the truth on record. That matters." It did. It mattered more than I could put into words. That same week, a nurse at the VA, Elise, caught me in the hallway between shifts. She held out her phone, showing me a leaked press bulletin she wasn't supposed to have access to. My name was in it. Medal of Honor recipient. Pending announcement. Public ceremony. Presidential acknowledgment. She whispered, "You're going to be on TV." I laughed. A single, stunned breath. Not exactly my style. She smiled. "Good. That means they won't see you coming." Word traveled faster than I expected. A junior officer from my old unit messaged me out of nowhere. Heard about the medal. About time. A retired Marine I treated in that convoy sent me a shaky video of himself saluting in his driveway. But none of it felt real, not yet. Until Cortez emailed me a copy of the new citation draft. My name. The full account. Line by line. All of it, this time, was true. And in the middle of that email chain, she'd written one sentence I'll never forget. "We were never invisible. They just weren't looking hard enough." I didn't confront them with a speech. There was no shouting. No grand declaration of, "You were wrong about me." That kind of scene would have required an audience that was willing to listen, and I knew better. When I received the formal Medal of Honor notification email, I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother. Not Matthew. And definitely not my father. Instead, I printed it. Heavy, glossy paper with the Department of Defense seal embossed at the top. Underneath was the full citation, my name, the location of the ambush, the account of what I did under fire. All the things I had waited years for someone to acknowledge were finally typed out in black and white. I slipped the letter into a simple manila envelope and drove to my parents' house early the next morning. It was quiet. Their car was in the driveway. The lawn needed mowing. Nothing had changed. I let myself in. My mother was still asleep. My father was in his chair, the one he refused to replace, even though the cushions were sunken from decades of his weight. He had the news on low, half watching, half scowling. Just like always. I didn't say a word. I walked into the kitchen and placed the envelope on the counter right next to the bowl of fruit and the newspaper my mother always pretended to read. I thought about leaving a note. Just a sticky tab on the front that said, "You might want to read this." But I didn't. That would have made it feel like I still wanted something from them: validation, apology, understanding. I didn't. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and looked at him. He didn't glance up. I waited for a heartbeat longer. Then I walked out. That night, I sat in my apartment with a drink in my hand, expecting something. A phone call, a text, even a message from Matthew with one of his sideways jabs disguised as congratulations. But there was nothing. The next day, I drove back to check on the envelope. My mother was in the garden. She waved, but didn't ask me in. I took that as a cue. When I slipped inside, the envelope was gone. I looked around. The fireplace was clean cold. No ashes this time. The counters were spotless. I checked the trash. Nothing. I almost walked back out, but something made me open the hallway cabinet, the one where my mom kept things like warranties and expired coupons. The envelope was there, unopened, shoved between a stack of junk mail and last year's Christmas cards. Not burned, not torn, just ignored. That was their confrontation. Not rage, not denial, just silence. Just that final, casual dismissal, the refusal to acknowledge what didn't fit their version of me. I stood there, fingers resting on the flap. Then I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because it didn't control me anymore. I walked out without taking the envelope. Left it exactly where they put it. That was my message to them. I wasn't going to beg them to see me. I'd already been seen, by the highest office in the country, by the men I'd saved, by the women who needed my story to be real. They didn't get to decide what I was anymore. And their silence? It was all the answer I needed. I never expected the moment to feel so quiet. People always imagine public recognition like a fireworks show, flashing lights, 1,000 cameras, maybe a tearful speech. But standing there in front of the White House, the Medal of Honor pinned to my chest, all I could hear was my own breathing. The applause felt distant, like it was for someone else. Like I was watching myself from a few feet outside my body. It wasn't the president's handshake that stunned me, or even the standing ovation from uniformed officers and officials who'd never met me. It was the fact that the story was finally being told, and this time, I wasn't the footnote. I had spent years being edited out of the frame, written off as a background character. But now my name was in the headlines. Now reporters were asking the same questions I used to whisper into the walls of my apartment. Why wasn't she recognized sooner? Why did her citation disappear? Why did no one follow up on the rescue logs? It started as a ripple. One blog. Then a veteran-run news outlet picked it up. Then a journalist from The Atlantic called. And then CNN. Not to talk about me exactly, but about what I represented. Why has no woman combat medic ever received the Medal of Honor before this? I didn't have a good answer. Because the truth? It's never just about one woman. It's about the system that forgets her on purpose. By the time the ceremony was over, my name was trending. Hashtags I didn't create were everywhere. Hashtag not just a nurse. Hashtag kill save them. Hashtag rewrite the record. I didn't post anything. I didn't even own a Twitter account. But it didn't matter. Others did it for me. Women from other branches sent messages. Old photos. Journal entries. One wrote, "I sewed a man's chest shut under sniper fire in Fallujah. My COs said not to make it a thing. I watched your ceremony." I sobbed. It wasn't just the military either. The VA board quietly began an internal review of award nominations from female personnel that were lost or unsubstantiated. Several more were reopened. And someone leaked the email chain between Major Renner and a Pentagon liaison. The phrase "inappropriate to elevate a non-combat female" set the internet on fire. He'd used it in writing. The coward didn't even bother to use euphemisms. Matthew called that night. Left a voicemail. Serena. I saw it. The ceremony. Look, I didn't know. I guess none of us did. Just, congratulations. I didn't call back. Not because I was angry. I wasn't, not really. Just empty. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Even my father couldn't escape it. His VA doctor told me later. The staff turned up the TV in the ward. Some of the older veterans stood to salute when they saw my name. They didn't know the man in the corner bed was my father. He didn't clap. Didn't speak. But he didn't change the channel either. The next morning, the Washington Post printed my citation word for word. No edits. No spin. Just the facts. That might have been the first time in my life I saw the truth about myself in black and white without needing to fight for it. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the burn marks or the silence. But it tilted the ground beneath us, just enough to feel the shift. And for the first time, the world turned and looked at me. Not with curiosity or pity or suspicion, but with respect. Power doesn't always come in the form of a courtroom verdict or a public apology. Sometimes, it's just the shift in how the world speaks your name. After the ceremony, everything that had once felt out of reach began turning toward me slowly, like a tide rolling back in. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't need to. The calls started coming on their own. From panels, from foundations, from military leadership I'd never even met. They wanted to hear my journey. They wanted me to serve as a female trailblazer in uniform. Now I was an asset, a symbol, a living exception to the story they'd all helped write. Funny how quickly people want to stand beside you once the spotlight hits. But I didn't care about their ceremonies. I was watching for something else. When the news of the ceremony finally hit full saturation, national coverage, primetime debate shows, podcasts dissecting gender and valor in the military, Matthew posted a photo of me on LinkedIn. My uniform. The medal. Captioned, "Proud of my sister. She taught me what courage really looks like." It had 20,000 likes in 3 hours. He never tagged me. Didn't even send it. Just claimed the moment like he'd always believed in it. Like he'd always believed in me. And that's when it hit me. People weren't trying to erase me anymore. Now they were trying to attach themselves to my fire like it wouldn't burn. I didn't respond. But I watched. Because power isn't always speaking. Sometimes, it's being the one everyone has to explain themselves to. The VA leadership that had passed me over twice, they invited me back, offered a senior training position. "We believe your experience is invaluable to the next generation of medics," the director said in a voicemail. I forwarded it to Elise. She just replied, "Told you." A retired general from the Pentagon called to personally thank me for my service and apologize on behalf of those who didn't see my worth. I let it go to voicemail. Saved it, but never replied. And then came the one that stopped me cold. A letter. Thick envelope. White with the gold DoD crest. Inside, an official apology. Signed by the Secretary of Defense. They acknowledged the delay in recognition. Acknowledged the misfiling. Acknowledged that systemic bias contributed to a failure to uphold the standards of honor, integrity, and accuracy. They didn't name Major Renner. But I didn't need them to. He knew. I knew. Now the world did too. I placed that letter in the same binder where I'd kept my helmet cam footage and the original citation from Lieutenant Colonel Cortez. Same binder I used to keep under my bed like a secret. Now it sat on my desk. Not hidden. Not whispered about. Seen. Later that week, a reporter asked me what it felt like to finally be vindicated. I didn't give her the soundbite she wanted. I said, "Vindication is when the people who doubted you have to sit in silence while the truth plays on every screen in the country." She blinked. I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to be let in. I was choosing who I let out. And that's power. After the ceremony, after the cameras shut off and the crowds faded, I didn't go home right away. Instead, I flew west. Rented a car. Drove 6 hours into the mountains with the medal still boxed in my duffel like it was just another piece of gear. No press. No escort. Just me and the hum of the road. There were 2 names I needed to visit before I could move forward. Corporal Dustin Rangel and Lance Corporal Josh Nguyen. They survived that day in Kandahar because I got to them in time. I knew they'd both been medically retired, both living quiet, private lives. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't ask to meet. That wasn't what this was about. I found their graves in a quiet cemetery in Oregon. They had passed years later, Rangel from complications related to his injuries, Joshi from something the Army never trained us to treat, a war that didn't end when the shooting stopped. I brought no flowers, just a copy of my Medal of Honor citation, folded neatly in a sealed plastic sleeve. I placed one at each headstone. Then I sat in the grass, back against the cool stone, and let the silence do what my words never could. I whispered, "They tried to bury you with me." And then, "But we're still here." After that, I started saying yes to speaking invitations, but only on my terms. I declined press junkets, glossy profile features, and the women in uniform segments that always ended with soft music and a fade to black. Instead, I spoke at military academies. Only when the requests came from women. West Point, Fort Jackson, Paris Island. The first time I stood in front of a group of cadets, I looked out and saw the reflection of everything they were about to endure. Brilliance wrapped in doubt, strength forced to whisper until it screamed. I told them the truth. I told them about the ash in the fireplace, the letter they burned, the silence that followed me home, the system that waited for me to die quietly so it wouldn't have to write me in. But I also told them this: you don't owe anyone your silence, and you don't need their permission to survive. Some cried. Some stood straighter. One hugged me in the hallway and slipped a note into my hand. It just said, "I believe you. Thank you for believing in you." That's what legacy is. Not the medal. Not the articles. Not the apology from the Secretary of Defense. Legacy is what lives in the people who rise because you refuse to fall. It's in the nurse at the VA who told me, "I started wearing my uniform again after I saw your story." It's in the former recruit who emailed to say, "I thought I was crazy for remembering things no one wanted me to say out loud." It's in the silence that no longer feels like defeat, but proof of how much noise I made without even trying. I didn't reclaim my legacy with revenge. I reclaimed it with truth, with the names I saved, with the ones who saved me, with the proof that I existed fully, fiercely, without needing anyone's permission. I wasn't their daughter. I wasn't their sister. I wasn't even their soldier. I was mine. And finally, that was enough. There's a point where anger becomes too heavy to carry. You think it'll keep you upright, that it'll fuel your next move, give you the strength to fight. But after a while, it just wears you down, slows your breath, clutters your mind, makes you start confusing movement with progress. I didn't need revenge. I needed air. After the ceremony, after the citation, after the world finally saw what I'd done, I thought I might want to confront them. Just once. My father, my brother, even my mother, with her quiet complicity. I imagined showing up to their house, medal in hand, standing in their living room and asking, "Still think I was just playing soldier?" But every time that image came to mind, it felt small. It felt like I'd be walking backward. So I didn't go. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't send a letter. I didn't wait for theirs either. They had my number. They had the same internet everyone else did. They saw the coverage. I know they saw the footage. My face was on every news outlet for a week. The silence wasn't ignorance anymore. It was a choice. And that was fine, because I had made a choice too. I wasn't going to spend another second proving myself to people who had no intention of seeing me clearly. The moment I realized I didn't need their approval, something in me unlocked. I stopped shrinking. I stopped checking their social media. I stopped replaying Matthew's words at that dinner table. I stopped asking myself what would have happened if my father had just looked up at the TV, just once, and said, "That's my daughter." Instead, I started focusing on the people who did show up. Like Lieutenant Colonel Cortez, who still emailed me every few weeks to check in, not with praise, but with respect. Or Nurse Elise, who slipped a handwritten note into my locker that said, "You didn't just survive. You changed the map for the rest of us." Or the widow of one of the Marines I saved, who mailed me a photo of his children in Little League jerseys with a sticky note. "They know who you are. They call you Andy Kale. None of those people owed me anything. And still, they gave me everything I never got from my own blood. Somewhere along the line, I learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the absence of begging. I didn't grovel. I didn't scream. I didn't write long Facebook posts hoping they'd finally understand. I just walked away, with my head up. Not because I'd won something, but because I'd let go of the weight they kept trying to hang around my neck. Letting go didn't make them right. It just made me free. Sometimes silence is not the wound, it's the closure. And in that quiet, I found something bigger than justice or validation. I found myself whole, unapologetic, unburdened. And in that stillness, I finally heard the one voice that had been there the entire time, waiting beneath the noise. Mine. It took me weeks to decide what to do with the ashes. They weren't even all there, just fragments. Burnt edges of the original letter. Bits of the seal still intact. My name half charred, like it had tried to survive the fire. I found them in the fireplace months ago. The morning CNN said my name in front of the entire nation. The day my father turned his face to the wall as the president read my citation. I didn't cry when I found them. I didn't scream. But I kept them. At first, I told myself I was just documenting the truth, another receipt, another piece of evidence in a story no one believed until it was too loud to ignore. But as time passed, I realized what those ashes were. They weren't proof of betrayal. They were the last thing they tried to erase and failed. So I framed them. Not in anything grand. Just a simple glass shadow box with a dark wooden edge. Inside, I placed the charred remains of the letter alongside a small brass plate engraved with 4 words. Still standing. Still here. No name. No date. No explanation. If you knew, you knew. I didn't send it right away. I kept it on my desk for a while. Let it sit in the corner of my vision while I worked, while I wrote, while I rebuilt a life that didn't rely on anyone else's narrative. Then, one afternoon, early spring, before the dogwoods bloomed, I wrapped it in brown paper, wrote the return address as blank, and mailed it to my parents' house. No note. No warning. No message. Just the silence they'd given me, returned with interest. I don't know what they did when they opened it. Maybe they threw it out. Maybe they argued about who burned it. Maybe they didn't speak at all, just set it on a shelf and walked away like it was a piece of junk mail. But none of that mattered. Because the box wasn't for them. It was for me. It was the final step in letting go, not of the truth, not of what I earned, but of the weight they made me carry to get there. People think closure is a conversation, a breakdown, a hug, a scream, an apology whispered through tears. Sometimes it's none of those things. Sometimes it's a framed ruin. Sometimes it's an empty mailbox. Sometimes it's the decision to walk past the phone without checking if they finally called. That frame didn't hold a piece of my past. It held the evidence that I survived it. And that in spite of everything. I never stopped existing. That's the thing about symbolic closure. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need a round of applause. Or a standing ovation. Or even forgiveness. It only needs one truth. You're not waiting for anyone else to understand anymore. And in that, I finally found peace. Absolutely. Here's the emotionally immersive, first-person expansion of. Years passed. The buzz faded. The interview slowed. My name stopped trending. And I was okay with that. I never wanted to be famous. I wanted to be real. Recognition came, but not the way I used to dream about. Not with applause from my father or a handwritten letter from my brother saying he was wrong. That version never came. Probably never will. But other kinds of recognition did. One morning, I was walking through the VA when I noticed something on the wall near the main conference room, a framed photo of Medal of Honor recipients from our region. Someone had added mine. No announcement. No unveiling. Just there. Next to men in full dress blues. Faces carved in history. I stared at it for a while. The photo they used wasn't from the ceremony. It was from a quiet moment after, just me in uniform, holding my citation folder, eyes down, no smile. Like I hadn't realized they were taking it. I liked that. Because it wasn't about the pose. It was about the presence. In the years that followed, My name started showing up in textbooks, quiet mentions in military history classes. The first female combat medic to receive the Medal of Honor. A sentence. A paragraph. Then a page. I never asked for inclusion. But they stopped asking if I deserved it. That was the shift. Recognition without apology. Without conditions. Without, but she only, or despite being a woman, or in a support role. Just Staff Sergeant Serena Kale. Once, at a military medical conference, I stepped into a panel room early. Two young medics were talking, one flipping through the program. He said, "Is that the woman who saved those two Marines in Kandahar?" The other nodded. "Yeah. She's real quiet. Doesn't even post online." The first one said, "Still a badass, though." They didn't know I was behind them. I didn't interrupt. Just sat down, let the panel start. Because that's what I wanted. Not attention. Not pity. Not endless arguments about whether I earned it. I just wanted the truth to settle into the world like a stone in still water. No splash. Just wait. Even in the Pentagon, they eventually hung a portrait. Modest, no gilded frame, just standard issue. It hangs in a hallway near the Women in Service archive. Most people walk by without noticing. But I saw it once. I stood in front of it alone on a trip I didn't announce, didn't photograph. No family photos around it. No plaque about who my father was. Just my name, my rank, the date of the award. And the uniform. The same one I wore when my mother looked away and my father turned up the volume on the TV, but not for me. And still, there it hangs. In a federal building they'll never step inside. That's what makes it beautiful. Because recognition that requires apology isn't recognition. It's performance. But this was earned. This was permanent. This was mine. And if they never say sorry? Fine. History already did it for them. I never went back to the house. Not because I was angry. I just didn't need to anymore. Not because I was angry. I just didn't need to anymore. After everything, the burned letter, the silence, the ceremony, I realized something no one ever teaches you in war or family. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is leave, quietly. I moved to the mountains. A cabin. Remote enough that the only noise came from wind through trees and the occasional hum of passing storms. No medals on the wall. No headlines taped to the fridge. Just space. Breath. A clean slate. Most days, I run field training for young female medics. Combat first aid, trauma response, quiet confidence. No uniforms required. No rank needed. Just grit and presence. We don't talk about awards. We talk about staying alive. About not waiting to be written into someone else's story. At night, I sit on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the light disappear behind the hills. There's a flag folded beside me, not the one from the ceremony, but the one I kept tucked in my rucksack all those years ago. The one that still smells like sand and smoke and blood. No one asks about it. They just sit with me. And that's enough. Sometimes a letter arrives. From a cadet. From a veteran. From a woman still serving who says, "I didn't think anyone like me existed until I read about you." I keep them in a box under the bed, not because I'm hiding them, but because they're mine. Matthew emailed once. Just said, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. That's the thing about this path, it doesn't ask for revenge. It doesn't crave noise. It just moves forward. I didn't reinvent myself. I just peeled off everything that never belonged to me. The shame, the silence, the expectation that I needed someone else's blessing to be whole. Now, when people ask what I do, I say, I teach women how to stay alive. And how to stay seen. That's enough. No parade. No confrontation. Just a quiet, undeniable truth. I was never waiting for them to believe in me. I believed in myself. And I walked away stronger than they ever imagined. Because strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it leaves. Softly. Without permission. And never looks back.